After 2 wonderful days seeing the Pembina Gorge and spending time in Walhalla, we left our little camp spot at Riverside Campground in Walhalla and left to go to Icelandic State Park near Cavalier, North Dakota. We did have a couple of interesting stops along the way. It's only 45 miles, but it's a pretty interesting 45 miles. We did see a small school from Cavalier County or Pembina. No, I believe it's Pembina County. Stopped and took a few pictures. Then we ran across a fellow that surprised his wife and bought a nuclear missile, anti-ballistic missile site. And he gave us a tour, an interesting tour of the anti-ballistic missile site. I wonder how he told his wife he bought one.
So the way it worked was, if there was a threat, they would say RSL-31, and then they know that the threat would be at this building, or RSL-34, and then when the helicopters could be oriented with how they approach the site.
Anyway, and from there we found out that the new military branch, Space Force, is in North Dakota, and they have a base right outside of Cavalier. Space Force Cavalier. Interesting.
Here at Cavalier Space Force Station, we are at a geographically significant place within the North American continent. We are oriented northbound so we can detect and track all missiles coming southbound. The Perimeter Acquisition Radar Attack Characterization System.
Well, 2 vehicles outside the fence.
Out in the middle of the fields, Space Force. Wow.
Then on to the state park, which, you know, we didn't stay there. We just wanted to spend the day there. So we went through the campgrounds, and it's a very nice campgrounds. There's a small reservoir there, swimming beach, nice spots, a bit crowded, wasn't as peaceful as Riverside was up in Walhalla. It was a very packed weekend for Icelandic Park. And then after just touring the campgrounds, we went ahead and went over to the museum and the grounds. They have some of the original settlement, the Icelandic church. There's both a museum at the campgrounds and across the road that Cavalier put together. But a lot of interesting pieces to the history of that area and what brought the Icelanders there. It was very tough living. You know, I think of how good we have it and how easy we have it. You know, when I look back in history, these people struggled, man. Really struggled. So here's the little tour of the campground and a bit of that. At the end of this, there will be a bit of history about the area and about how the Icelanders got here.
Gun logs and
That's
nature trails.
Why they were focused on. This must have been their land.
Wild plum, raspberry, chokecherry, and June berries. Let's get some June berries. Wild raspberries.
That'd be nice.
Yeah. We'll do the wildwood. Is this the wildwood?
Yeah, I'm sure of it. You are here, see.
Oh yeah, this way. This way. Let's go straight.
Ahead will take us to the river.
Yeah,
the
let's
quickest.
just go. Yeah, let's just go down here.
Yeah, and stuff.
Milkweed, huh?
Mhm.
It's just by the name.
Because you've seen the pods,
Weed.
right? The silver pod, and it throws out this really wispy.
Or stream or whatever it is. All right, here's the bridge. The railing's hot, Linda. We're going to return for what's called the Deuce, which is August the Deuce. It's in Mountain, very close to Cavalier, about a reenactment of a lot of this Icelandic background. So anyway, I hope you enjoy the history that's coming up and the tour of the campground and a little bit of these interesting facts that we saw along the way as we left Walhalla, the Pemina Gorge, to go and learn about Icelanders traveling to North Dakota, traveling and settling in North Dakota. Hope you enjoy.
By 1878, the Paulsmen left New Iceland to settle in Dakota. There is much more to this story, and I highly recommend this book by George J. Hauser. While Pastor Paul, only lived in North America for 10 years, his outstanding accomplishments and vision created a legacy that continues today for the Icelandic descendants of Dakota. Let's move on now to the feature where Pastor Paul explains the founding of the Icelandic settlement in Dakota, which he dictated on the 11th of February, 1882.
It was in the fall of 1876 that I made my first acquaintance with the so-called Red River Valley. The news reached me while in Wisconsin, where I was serving Icelandic and Norwegian congregations, that more than 1,000 Icelanders were on their way across Canada, intending not to stop until they had reached the just-discovered New Iceland, Nýja Ísland, in western Canada. At that time, railroads did not extend far northward through the valley. Therefore, I had to take passage in a Red River steamer, 150 miles as the crow flies, and 400 to 500 by river, northward to the city of Winnipeg in Manitoba, brought into the same hardships. I therefore decided to see a more advantageous location immediately that spring, although because of their extreme poverty, it was doubtful whether many could avail themselves to the opportunity to emigrate. The following men accompanied me: Johan Haltson, his son Gunnar, and Magnus Stephenson from Gimli. In Winnipeg, Sigurður Jósa Bjornsson and Arni Thorlaksson joined us. When we left Gimli, it was uppermost in our minds not to search for land until in Lyon County, Minnesota, in the vicinity of the Icelandic settlement there. During our stay in Winnipeg, Magnus Stephenson chanced to have a conversation with a certain editor who said he was acquainted with conditions in North Dakota and that he could not direct us to a better location than the so-called Pemina Mountain. This man seemed genuinely touched by the hardships of the Icelanders in New Iceland and desired to have an opportunity to speak to me about the Pemina locality. At first, I thought that he was a land speculator who owned lands in the district and therefore wished to see them settled at the earliest date. Nevertheless, I considered it unwise to ignore his counsel altogether. Hence my companions and I decided to stop at Pemina just south of the Canadian border. From there, make a journey westward to the Pemina Mountains. We left the steamer at Pemina late in the day and stayed overnight at an unimpressive lodging house on the riverbank. for at that time there were not many, much less noteworthy, buildings in the place. The next morning we traveled on foot westward over the prairie south of the so-called Tongue River, which flows east from the Pembina Hills. Not a house was then to be seen on the prairie, and only here there were along the edge of the forest on the riverbank of the settlement along the Tongue River, but then began a continuous wilderness on all sides. From Cavalier we journeyed the next day in the same direction out into the wilderness. Then the forest along the river became more extensive, the land higher and less fertile. We walked on either side of the river, which forms there a deep valley, until we were in sight of mountains. Then the land, all of a sudden, became lower. As far as the eye could see, to the south and west, we saw before us green lowlands with stretches of wood. In the west, the hills met the eye. The appearance of the land now seemed to us what we call in Iceland rural. I considered it self-evident that we should select a site for a settlement east of the hills, although as yet far from a market town, because of the large forests seemingly ample throughout the region, if the soil proved to be equally fertile elsewhere as where we were halting at the time. The reason we had parted in the spring, Johann Haltsen had not long hesitated in returning to New Iceland to fetch his family and possessions. This aroused considerable interest among the people of New Iceland. The winter wore on. Men began to think about the question of emigrating and to discuss it, at first among themselves, and opinions differed as often is the case. Some even began writing patriotic songs of New Iceland. Framfari circulated these, but the public did not seem ready to respond to them. People became more and more convinced that the future of New Iceland was anything but promising. On the other hand, it was a matter of concern to leave one's homes and the fruits of one's labors during a long period, government loan, half-built churches, and the graves of one's beloved, and then have to begin anew in another wilderness. Finally, the movement for emigrating had reached such dimensions that the president of the district council, Olafur Olafsson Frau Espjoli, called a meeting, which was, however, attended by